So good evening. I'm Dr. Guddi Singh, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Intelligence Squared event at the Francis Crick Institute in London. Now, the Crick, as it's known, is a leading centre for biomedical research that is at the forefront of advances in genome editing, our theme for this evening. Now, tonight we'll be discussing whether gene editing is the next great health revolution and what this could mean for the future of humanity. Now, I need to let you know that there has been a slight change in our panel, you may have noticed. And instead of Professor Robin Lovell-Badge, who is sadly unwell this evening, we have in his place the brilliant molecular biologist, Dr. Güneş Taylor, who I will introduce along with the rest of our amazing panelists shortly. Now, before we get into this evening's conversation, why are we here today? The last decade has seen rapid advances in the development of gene editing techniques ever since a biological tool called CRISPR was developed to edit and replace sections of DNA in living organisms. This revolutionary technique can be used to help treat diseases such as cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, and some cancers, and its potential extends much further than this. We're at a stage where genome editing will radically transform the way we treat and see human health. But when scientific advances take place in a vacuum, unintended consequences can occur. So it's vital that the public has a say in the way that this technology is applied. So this event coincides with a free exhibition here at the Crick called Cut and Paste, which runs until December 2023. Created in partnership with the creative studio The Liminal Space, Cut and Paste is a fascinating, hands-on exhibition, and it investigates the ethics of gene editing and what this means for human diversity and our relationship with our bodies. We'll be exploring some of the themes here tonight. So, before I kick off the conversation, let me introduce our fantastic panel. So, here in the room, we have Dr. Güneş Taylor, a postdoctoral research scientist at the Francis Crick Institute. She specializes in using cutting-edge technology, I think that's a bit of a pun there, to understand how reproductive systems are built. She's spoken alongside popular scientists and experts such as Richard Dawkins, Yuval Noah Harari, and Lord Robert Winston. We also have lovely Shani Dhanda, an award-winning disability activist and inclusion specialist, and Tom Whipple, science editor at The Times. And also, joining us from the live stream, we have Jimi Olaghere, who is based in the US and was one of the first people in the world to receive a form of gene therapy to treat sickle cell disease. Güneş, I'd actually like to start with you and find out where exactly we are with the advances in genetic experimentation. I mean, it feels like to me we're at a unique moment in time in terms of what we're able to do in terms of manipulating genes. And yet I'm sure many people listening to this will be thinking, well, we've done genetic modification before. What makes this different? What is it about CRISPR technology that has pushed this on so much further?
Yes. Yes, that's an excellent question. We thought by changing the name to genome editing, people might have not noticed that it was in fact just genetic modification. But clearly I haven't fooled you. Yes, so the important thing to say is, well, CRISPR is just a new form of technology, basically. It's just another platform for doing something that we were doing before. The best analogy actually I have for this is it's a bit like the first smartphone to mobile phones and communication in general. Telephones existed before, mobile phones existed before, but we all kind of remember probably the first Apple iPhone that came out and thinking, okay, this is a total game changer. And it is. So CRISPR-Cas9, as it's called, is a game changer because of its precision, importantly. Okay? It's significantly more precise and programmable than previous generations of technology available for altering and modifying DNA. And that precision means that we can achieve far greater results. It's also faster to utilize and leverage in the lab, so that's also important, and it's pretty cheap too, so all those things definitely help. But the reason why this has been so revolutionary is because of this programmable precision that it brings, meaning that now, basically, anything that we know of that is encoded in DNA, whether it's in plants, animals, or human beings, is up for modification.
Right, so that's exactly it. It's the precision, isn't it? Because what we're looking at here is being able to change the genetic codes, we're talking about the genetic alphabet in any species, not just humans. And there's something specific about this specificity, isn't there, in terms of the kinds of diseases that this can impact? There's certain kinds of conditions that this is really, really good for.
Well, yes. In particular, if you're thinking about human beings and if you're thinking about the diseases that human beings get, any disease that we know is attributable to a single disease, to a single gene, in particular, is a prime candidate for this technology. Because if you know with certainty this gene A, whatever it is, causes this disease, we can now deal with it. Of course, not all diseases are attributable to a single gene, and so there is some limitation there for what we could potentially do. Potentially.
Yeah. Okay, so this precision is what's making it all so exciting, but there are some challenges and there are some current limitations with the technology in terms of using it more widely, aren't there? And is it simply that it's too precise to be able to be used for anything that's more complicated, or are there other issues with it?
No, so I think I would say just to remind you all, I'm sure you're all aware. So CRISPR-Cas9 or CRISPR for short, is a two-part molecular system, importantly. There's the CRISPR bit, that's the bit that's programmable, that you can encode to say, this is the piece of DNA I'm looking for that I want you to go find. And then there's the Cas9 bit, and the Cas9 bit is the sort of doing end of the setup. And what's really fascinating about this technology is a bit like iPhones have changed over time. We've also already started modifying this platform. So you can change the Cas9 to have different functions and different effects, basically. And so there's actually quite a lot that you can do with this technology. In fact, the range of things that we can do is really quite wide. But in terms of limitations, if you think about it, CRISPR can be used to change DNA, but DNA exists in one copy per cell. And each one of us, approximately, is several trillion cells moving around through space, which means several trillion copies of genomes, which means if you want to change something, you've got a real delivery problem, basically. So the main limitation at the moment, or the big conundrum, comes here, which is all of us start off life as one cell, and then we become several trillion cells. So we have this technology. It can be used to edit things in DNA. DNA is really important for health outcomes. At what point do you edit that DNA? Do you do it when you are one genome big in a single cell, or do you do it when you are several trillion cells big and you've got a real delivery problem, right? So therein lies the problem.
And therein lies the big ethical conundrums and some of the big questions that have arisen around the idea of things like designer babies and what so forth. But we will come to that.
I think, just to be really explicit about this, the reason why doing an edit on a single-celled embryo is ethically questionable or causes some questions to be raised is, just to be really precise for everyone in the audience, the implication is if you edit embryos that are really, really small, you will edit the cells that will go on to make the egg and sperm cells in the next generation. And so you edit them as well. Whereas if you edit a body that already exists, it's called somatic, you just change a body. You don't necessarily change the egg and sperm cells. So that's really important. That's heritable.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that you made that distinction, because what we're talking about there is this idea that we could even potentially be editing the evolution of the human species, which obviously has massive implications. But I'd like to talk to Jimi now and bring you into the conversation, because in a way you embody what we're talking about, all of the science that we've just been talking about, which is absolutely fascinating. You've actually had first-hand experience of what gene therapy can be like. Now, you lived with a condition called sickle cell anemia since you were born. I wonder whether you could just tell the audience here, what is it like to have sickle cell? What was your experience of it, just so that we can understand why it was so important for you to have the therapy in the first place?
My experience with sickle cell was tough. Sometimes it felt like, climbing Mount Everest stacked on top of Kilimanjaro. There was no end in sight. Constantly living out of hospitals. Of course, we all know the cornerstone of the disease is constant pain that just constantly lingers, and then all your organs are also at play. in jeopardy. I've had a heart attack, gallbladder taken out, a vascular necrosis. It's just insurmountable odds that actually makes it quite difficult to live. So at some point in my life, I found myself really questioning the quality of my life, whether it's actually even worth living with everything that's going on with sickle cell. And, with luck, I found CRISPR. I thought it was going to be a solution for the future, 20, 30 years in the future. And luckily, I found this article that came into my inbox, and I qualified, for something that I thought was 20 years in the future. It happened 2 years after, I'd had this discussion with my parents to try and figure out a way to improve my quality of life. And life post-transplant is surreal. Every day I wake up, I'm still in awe. I'm still shocked as to what I'm able to do compared to what my life was like before pre-transplant. The boundless amounts of energy that I had before. I couldn't even climb a flight of stairs without taking a break to catch my breath. Now I need people to tell me to slow down, because I just, I'm constantly on the go because of how CRISPR has really changed my life. One of the things I feel like it's really given me is control. As a young man, as a teenager or a kid growing up, you feel like your parents kind of control your life because they're adults and they kind of direct you. And then when you get older, you get to this period where you think you're going to take control of your life. But in my case, I didn't have control of my life as well. Sickle cell directed every aspect in which my life went. And then, as a 35-year-old man, I finally have control of my life, and it is unreal.
Oh, Jimi, it's really moving to hear you talk about the transformative effect that the gene therapy has had for you. And I'm so glad that you're able to share the story with us. Just to clarify for the audience who are listening, so sickle cell anemia is a disease that is basically caused by genetic alteration in the hemoglobin structure. So that's what forms our blood cells. And when these blood cells are not forming in the normal way, they become sickle-shaped, and they can have all sorts of different symptoms. And actually, I wonder whether, Jimi, you could just tell us some of the other symptoms as well as pain that you had and how it would present for you. Because again, I think it's just really important for people to understand the impact that conditions like this can have on ordinary people.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have these, really violent pain episodes that we'll call sickle cell crises that, it's very difficult to describe. It just feels like your whole body just is in a wave of pain that can last for months, where you need intravenous medication in order to control that pain. So that, when I lived up north in the tri-state area, that particularly in the winter months, that would happen almost twice a week to 2 times. Sometimes, I'll be living out of the hospital just to keep this pain under control. So that's one of the most important pieces of sickle cell, is just that constant pain. And when it escalates and becomes chronic, that you desperately need to seek hospital help, that's when it really gets bad. But then, like I said, you also have because the blood cells all your organs basically need good blood flow back and forth. And with sickle cell, you don't have that good blood flow. So I had a heart attack once because I wasn't having good blood flow to my heart. My gallbladder had to be taken out at quite a young age as well, because of the same similar reason of just not having enough blood flow to it. And then multiple pulmonary embolisms, acute chest syndrome, pneumonia. The disease is really, the way it manifests in your life and way it creeps into it, it's actually sometimes hard to describe as obviously having a problem, because it goes into every facet, where you grow up, where you plan to go to school, relationships, all of that. It's really, really difficult.
Yeah, gosh. And you're illustrating there again just how important it is to think about disease affecting every aspect of a person's life, and especially as a child. I mean, this started from the day you were born, right? And what's really interesting to me, and a bit of your story that I think is really interesting for the audience to hear, is that when you were a child, you were not in the States, right? You were in Nigeria. And
No.
that's part of why the symptoms were so catastrophic in terms of the treatment that you were able to access and the healthcare there. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, and then also then how you then were able to get onto the CRISPR trial.
Okay. So I was actually born here in the States. At the time, 1985, in Nigeria, they didn't have the amniocentesis test that would confirm if you have any genetic condition. My parents were fortunate enough to fly my mom over while she was pregnant to Washington, D.C. She had that amniocentesis test, which in fact confirmed that, I would have sickle cell. And, they still decided to, bring me to life. Because back then, my mom told me that, the natural course of action, particularly if you're from Nigeria, because people or children with sickle cell in Nigeria didn't live past the age of 5. So, some doctors, they were of the belief that there's no point in bringing a child to life that's not going to see 5 years old. But because I was born here in the U.S., I got really fortunate. They gave birth to me here. I became an American citizen. And, we went back home, like you said, to Nigeria for a little bit. And there's this one particular story I think I told you when we, touched base earlier was I used to do this thing as a young boy. At the end of class, I'd go in front of the chalkboard and steal chalk. And I would find myself really taking all these weird substances and taking it home with me, and find myself in the corner eating chalk, eating foam, and really thinking I was going crazy. And then I moved over to the States, and that thing that was happening, these behaviors that I was manifesting in Nigeria turned out to be a condition called pica, where you are lacking nutrients. So I was lacking a lot of nutrients because I had sickle cell. But it just goes to show, like you said, at the time at least, the disparities in the two healthcare system. In one country, I thought I was nuts, and in the other country, it is actually turned out to be a condition that they were treating, and they gave me all these folic acid and all these things. So my body wasn't in need of those nutrients.
Yeah, and just to draw out again that distinction between the different health systems, because I think this is really important for us to think about the global inequalities that exist, right, in terms of what's available. You're lucky enough now to be able to talk to us about all of your experiences. You've had literally a 180-degree reversal of your fortunes, and I don't think it's exaggerating for me to say that it has been life-changing for you.
Yeah.
But of course, that has come by being in the United States, where you've had access to this cutting-edge technology. And I wonder how you think about the Jimmy that might have stayed in Nigeria, or all the kids who are still in Nigeria and don't have access to this. How does that make you feel?
That's a fantastic question, because I'm a big believer in a Stoic principle called amor fati, which is, loving one's fate. And, the irony of me saying this is not lost on me, because I'm obviously through on the other side. But that statement simply, it translated from Latin simply means, being happy with the cards you're dealt, no matter how tragic your situation is. And while I was in the throes of the disease, if someone would have said that to me, I would have been pissed, if I'm honest. But, the truth is, I only time will tell. I mean, I definitely feel and carry a lot of guilt too, as well, for people that are not going to get to access what I have access to, at least not in the next 5 to 6 years. There's definitely, me going through the process itself through a year. I can't even picture how it's going to be, transported and made commercially ready for places like Africa and India, where these therapies are desperately needed. I know they're working on things called in vivo now, where we don't have to do the conditioning that I had to go through. So I'm guessing that's what it's going to be when these therapies can be taken as a pill, but I can see that still being, not a pill, rather just a simple infusion. But I still see that being, decades and decades away from happening. Hopefully not.
Thank you, Jimmy. And look, this raises this really important question about what happens to medical advances. And, it's gene editing today. We had the vaccine development during the pandemic. And it could even just be in terms of access to skilled health workers. How are we distributing this stuff globally? And it is a question that, I think we should park it for now, but I would like to come back to that later. But I want to bring you into the conversation, Shani, because this idea of fairness and this idea of inequality is something that's very close to my heart. And I know something that you care about deeply too. And I want to talk about this question of inequalities in accessing cutting-edge advances in science, because obviously we have inequalities in this country as well. But maybe you could speak a little bit about some of the experiences you've had in terms of barriers to accessing quality healthcare. And what have you seen both as a user, but also in your life as an activist?
So I was born with a rare genetic condition. It's called, this fancy word, osteogenesis imperfecta. It's more commonly known as brittle bone disease. It affects around 1 in 20,000 people in the UK. And the condition's characterized by bones that break without any trauma. So it's like coughing and breaking a rib. It's like your bones are made out of glass, essentially. And by the age of 14, I had broken my legs 6 times. And I heard the gasp that I normally get. But actually, I'm very lucky because people with my condition break between 300 to 400 times in their life. So I have nothing to complain about, what 6 breaks in comparison. But although it's a genetic condition, it doesn't run in my family. So I'm a spontaneous mutation, which is fun to be. And so when I was born, the doctors knew something wasn't quite right, didn't know what it was. Then it took me 2 years to get a diagnosis. So I'm a Brummie originally. Came down to Great Ormond Street. And, from what I've learned from my parents, it was difficult. Doctors were like, yeah, she's got this condition. We can't say what she will or won't be able to do. And, I spent a lot of my childhood in hospital. And transitioning into adult care was a real culture shock. You have to fight for everything. I feel like when I was a child, the NHS was in a great place. I remember nurses having time to play games with me at my, because I was in hospital for months on end. And I think one of the biggest barriers now is obviously the chronic underfunding that the NHS has had. Another thing that I've experienced is because of a lot of medical professionals or consultants I meet, they will only ever read about my condition. When they meet me, they treat me like some sort of phenomena, which is, I understand it, but it's also annoying because I'm going to them for their advice. When you go and see a medical professional, you're going for a hug, essentially, because you're the expert, in this, and you want them to help you manage your condition. But I don't feel like I always get that. I feel like I have to educate them. In addition to that, if we talk about private healthcare, it doesn't cover my condition. So as someone who really relies on the NHS and the service of the NHS disproportionately, and now there's a lot of barriers to that because of long waiting lists and, et cetera, it's really worrying. And then finally, just to add, we know that there's so much bias when it comes to healthcare in lots of different ways. That can be, your race, your ethnicity. But I've had consultations with gynecologists who said, yeah, you need this operation, but we've never operated on anyone like you, so I'm not going to do it. And that's scary. So even though you might get in front of medical professionals, they're telling you that they're not confident to do their job with you.
Thank you, Shani, for saying all that. And let me just say, as a paediatrician, if I'd ever seen you in the wards, we would definitely be playing, and you'd definitely get a hug from me. But I'm sorry to hear that the medical profession hasn't always been able to make you feel cared for in the way that you deserve, as anyone else should. You're right that to think about some of the systemic issues that are at play there, it's not about individual professionals always, although there is a culture here that we need to talk about, and this is really where your experience is really important. What we're talking about here is a kind of discrimination that's happening by the very people who you're asking for help from. And, as you said, the doctors should have the expertise to deal with this. But you're right, of course, it's a rare condition. How many of us would have seen this? And yet there should be something that's happening here in terms of how you are received into the health service. Now, I wonder when we're talking about questions of cost and access, and there are lots of reasons for people to be quite rightly perhaps hesitant when it comes to things like gene editing therapy. At the exhibition, and if any of you have been looking at it, it points out this line between editing and enhancing. And I don't think that line is always very clear. And I'd love to hear what you've got to say, Shani, about, to you, what this means. Like, what does gene editing really mean to you? And what is it actually saying about disability?
You're absolutely right. And it's a really fine line. And we need to talk about eugenics as well when we talk about gene editing. So gene editing wouldn't help me with my condition. But when I've had genetic counselling, I was told if I was to have a child, then there's a 50% chance that child would be born with the same condition as me. And that affected my decision on whether I wanted to have kids or not. I can just barely keep my plants alive, and I didn't want to be responsible for looking after anybody else because I genuinely feel like I can just about look after myself. I just didn't think it would be fair to, then potentially raise a child that would have additional needs. I'm not bashing anybody who has, we all have that option in our own lives to do what we want to do, right? And I also have an ethical voice in my head that thinks, well, whilst this is great and this exists, and I believe everybody should have choice, for me personally, I think that if I was really meant to have kids, then I think my body would just be able to do it. Personally, that's my opinion. I feel like it's a bit too much interfering because, I've been told that they can strip the defective gene and then fertilize. I was just like, nah. It's a bit too invasive for me. And I just, but also I know that I don't have to give birth to be a mother if that's what I want to do as well. But I think that some people think gene editing is good because then there will be no disabled people born, but that's not the case because there are nearly 15 million disabled people in this country and 83% were born as non-disabled people. So
it's a staggering statistic, isn't it?
The majority of disabled people acquire their condition and impairment throughout their working life. And I know that there are countries like Iceland, I believe, that as part of their sort of pregnancy care, gene editing is quite routine. And I think in 1 year, like 3 children were born with Down syndrome. Like, obviously the population of Iceland is very small, but don't you think it would be really boring if we were all the same? I think so. And I'm going to come on to this a bit further. Like, it's not my condition that disables me. Disability is a social construct. So we have to also understand that living with a condition and an impairment is just an average part of being human, but we just have never been told that. No, we don't have that representation.
Yeah, some really profound things. Yes. Yes, thank you, Shani. That is like very profound what you're saying there. And this is what I meant, like when you're hearing about this, and I think Jimi's experience is a very different one, isn't it, in a way?
And I think that's great. And, I've had different medical treatments and interventions. And by the way, I'm not knocking healthcare. Like, I wouldn't have the quality of life that I have without it. And maybe I would feel differently if gene editing would be able to help me with my condition. But hearing Jimi's experience is life-changing. Why wouldn't you?
But I think what you also brought up was that kind of ickiness that we feel when it comes to things like gene editing and gene therapy, because it's almost like it hits at something so core to us as human beings, like what's inside ourselves and what actually helps us to become who we are, literally our genetic alphabets. Messing around with that somehow doesn't feel entirely normal somehow. And I want to take a step back here and ask you, Tom, who, you've done a lot of work on this subject. You've spoken to some of the world's leading experts on this. And having covered all of this stuff for the last many years, all of the advances in gene editing, how familiar do you think the general public are with the ethical questions that are concerned here surrounding gene editing. So not the technology and obviously the fanfare that comes with any new advance, but the ethical questions. And do you think that public opinion has shifted in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing is the speed of this. So I've been covering science for the Times since 2011, which doesn't feel that long for me. The technology we're talking about, CRISPR, was I can get into the timeline of it, but formally discovered in the form it's in now in 2012. And since then, it is, I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's spread faster than almost any other laboratory tool in history. And definitely it has spread ahead of the ethical debate. The interesting thing is the co-discoverer of it, and we can get into the extent that's true as well, because it's loads of people involved, but the Jennifer Doudna, who's really the face of CRISPR, was well aware of this. So I went to see her in 2018 in UC Berkeley, and brilliantly, her lab is on Oppenheimer Way. It's named after Oppenheimer, the creator of the atomic bomb, who saw it explode and said, "I've become death, destroyer of worlds." I mean, actually, I think someone stood next to him and said, "No, you said, fuck me, it works." But in his own memory afterwards said, "I've become death, destroyer of worlds," and then spent much of the rest of his career dealing with the ethical implications. And I think she's very much been the same. And realized, and I don't think there's any ethical implications to sickle cell anemia, other than the global equity things. But in the fundamentals of the technology, I don't see that as any different from any other technology. But when you get into other things, it does become interesting. And she convened a conference in 2015 to discuss human germline editing, the idea that you can basically edit human evolution, and what we do with this. And, do we have a total ban for now? Do we have a total ban forever? And whilst she talked to me about this and she convened this, whilst it happened, news came out that there had been some Chinese scientists who had edited human embryos and then destroyed the embryos, but they'd already crossed that line. And what I didn't know and what she didn't know is whilst we were talking, there was a woman pregnant in China with two babies, with twin girls, that were going to be born, that are the first CRISPR babies. So we have already done this. Well, just so, very briefly, the ethics are not easy. You will have, there are a few diseases and conditions where you have a single gene that you could switch. So a simple example, the BRCA1 gene, which greatly increases your chance of breast cancer. I don't think many people would have ethical objections to switching that, maybe. Now, you could actually do that in something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where you select the embryo that doesn't have it. I mean, to call that a more ethical way of going about things is itself, I think, far from clear. But I'll give one more example that shows to me just, I think, how difficult the ethics are. A lot of people will say in surveys, I am for correcting disease in the human genome. I'm not for enhancing. I'm not for making your super baby who's super clever, who's super these things. Imagine a putative gene which doesn't exist, but imagine this gene which gives you severe heart problems. And imagine there are three other forms. You can have one that just gives you a pretty crappy heart that's fine, one that gives you an average heart, and one that gives you the heart of an athlete. Now, when you change that gene, which I think most people would say you should change, don't give the gene that's going to kill you, which of those three alternatives do you choose? And if you choose the athlete's heart, is that fixing or is it enhancement?
Yeah, so total Pandora's box has been opened, hasn't it? And I think what's interesting about the interviews that you've done with, so it's Emmanuel Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna who have been awarded the Nobel Prize for CRISPR technology, although as you mentioned, and we should mention that there were lots of scientists who have been involved in this. Science is never done by one person alone. You would think that there'd be these wholehearted proponents for this technology having come up with it. And it's so interesting to hear that even they have reservations and that they have seen that the potential for it is just so wide. And it is exactly this where we're not able to draw a line. In medicine, there rarely is ever a clear line in the sand of what counts as wholeheartedly good and what counts as wholeheartedly bad. And clearly this is not going to be one of those easy topics either. But I think this comes back to what you said, Shani, about the perception of what disability actually is. Because if we accept that we are all born and we should celebrate our differences, that we are all different and that we should glory in those differences, then at which point do some of these differences become what we call a disability? And what is that actually saying about the world that we live in? And I want you to just riff on that for me, Shani. How does this make you feel when you think about this?
So there are two main models when it comes to disability. One's called the medical model, which we will all know of, even if you don't know, it's called the medical model. And one is called the social model, which I alluded to a little bit earlier. So as people that live with conditions and impairments, we learn about those conditions and impairments from non-disabled doctors who will tell us about our condition. But what they will, the one sentence that I needed to hear throughout my entire life from a medical professional is, it's society that disables you, it's not this condition. That one sentence. But I came across the social model by accident when I was at university, and it changed my life. And it simply talks about the fact that, you know, it's barriers and bias that are the disabling factors. So, you know, I'm 3'10", I'm the height of a 4-year-old. There are more clothes designed for dogs than disabled people. That's not because of me or my health condition. That's because whoever's in charge of making and designing and selling clothes only make them for certain types of bodies. The fact that I live in London but only 33% of the tube network is accessible. And when I went on the Elizabeth line for the first time the other week, I was nearly in tears. It's accessible and beautiful and it can be done. So coming back to this, you know, it's not our conditions an impairment that disables us. However, we do need to be able to manage them. We do need to be able to manage them in order to live in society. But so ableism is the social prejudice and discrimination of disabled people. It's a lesser known ism, like you have racism, sexism. And at its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that typical abilities or non-disabled bodies are superior. But then when we look into that more, that roots back to productivity and capitalism, because as people, we're all expected to contribute to society and work and, you know, put money in, and when you're at pension age, take it out. But that's not always going to be the case. And, you know, I'm sitting here with a lot of privilege today, and something that I can't quite get my head around is I have this privilege because of colonialism. So my grandparents came to this country as economic migrants, and that's the reason that I was born in this country. Like my dad was born in India. Oh my God, if I had been born in India on a farm where my family are in North India in Punjab, I dread to think what my life would have been like. And 80% of disabled people live in rural areas because of the lack of healthcare, the lack of infrastructure.
Gosh, Shani. Yeah, well, again, everything that you said is completely on point. And I just want to clarify and just underline what you said there about the distinction between the medical model of disability, which is basically where it kind of tries to define a condition or impairment as one that needs to be cured. In opposition to what you're saying, which is this social model, which is, it argues that actually it's societal barriers that disable people, and it's not necessarily the condition that needs to be cured. Although, of course, what we're talking about is that there are conditions, just like Jimi's, that can be cured with this therapy. And, you know, as a clinician, I'm looking at the potential of what CRISPR can do, and there's clear applications here, which are really hopeful, I think. But just as you said, Tom, like, how generalizable is that? Like, what are we willing to actually apply this to? And how will we have those discussions? And I think that's a really important thing to think about, is how do we have those discussions about what matters here?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think also, having said the ethics has got ahead of this, or the science has got ahead of the ethics, as soon as you start having the ethics discussion, you get so far ahead of the science. Like, essentially, we don't know what most of the genome does. And you can talk about designer babies, but you'd have a real problem designing them beyond these few quite specific conditions. The other sort of, you couldn't. We've got sort of, thousands of genes that are very, very slightly associated with intelligence. And if you went in and hit them all, you'd probably end up with all sorts of other things going on as well. And the technology is not good enough for that anyway. Last week, I covered a study as well that shows one other slight thing I slightly worry about is losing diversity in a very specific genetic sense, in that we've got all of these genes that are a product of a long period of evolution. I mean, actually, as Jimi will know, sickle cell is a great example of this. It's the reason it persists is because it has historically given protection against malaria. And last week I covered a study about a gene or a genotype, a variant, which is offered amazing protection against the Black Death. There's this lovely study where they studied graveyards before, during, and after the Black Death. And if you had this variant, then you were 40% protected to Black Death. You are currently protected against COVID, against pneumonia, against all sorts of things. And you could well imagine seeing that data set and saying, let's give everyone this. But the reason why everyone doesn't have this is outside of pandemics, you are far more likely to suffer from autoimmune diseases such as Crohn's. And so the idea that you can just simply go in with these beautiful scissors, go chop, chop, and away you go, actually belies the severe lack of understanding we still have about genome.
So yeah, essentially it's way more complicated than we would like to think. And even with CRISPR technology, which is precise and which does give us more control than we've ever had of our genetic code, we basically still are playing with fire here. We don't really know what we're doing. Now, Güneş, you seem like you want to come in here with something. What is this all like bringing up for you in terms of the science? Because you're here at the Crick. This is one of the places that's leading in terms of the advances in genetic editing. What are you thinking, and what is the Crick actually doing to take some of these ethical considerations into account?
So, yes, Tom raised the point nicely. So I think what's really important in this conversation is to be really clear about actually the central, everything that we're talking about comes down to, is it in our DNA, right? I said to you, CRISPR-Cas9 CRISPR is a tool for editing DNA. Anything that's in your DNA can therefore potentially be edited. But what something that is in your DNA does, and the effect that it has, is not necessarily within our control, right? So as Tom said, certain traits, certain things that we're interested in are sort of diffuse through the genome. There's not one place for it. On top of that, there's loads of traits that we seem to care about that aren't necessarily, it's not a one-to-one thing. It's not like, oh, here's a token, now you have it. Some genes are like that. Some bits of DNA are like that. But some of them are just, here's, like Tom said, a variant. What's a variant? It means something that makes you slightly more likely to in the scale of an entire population, right? It doesn't necessarily mean anything about your life as an individual. It means something about your potential odds in a life in a context of many other variants doing many other things, right? I always give the same slightly facetious example, which is, say I decided to have children, and let's say I went through the IVF route so that I could try and edit them and help them. I could tweak every gene I wanted. Let's just say that happens. I tweak every gene I wanted to every possible variant that could be possibly useful for any possible thing. Let's give them the best possible chance they have. If that baby is born and I don't feed it, and I don't take it to school, and I don't socialize it, and I don't do any of those things to it, all those variants come to nothing, right? That's really important to keep in mind. Something else that came up that I think is really, really important to address in this context, exactly as you said, is we're in the Francis Crick Institute, right? So we are having an ethical debate about this technology in a context where, if Robin was here, he would be being very clear about this. It is not allowed to edit human embryos and implant them in a substantial number of countries across Earth. Some countries don't have ethical guidelines yet, and this is something that people have been discussing since the day the paper came out. Tom also already alluded to this. What's been incredible about this technology is the fact that from the day the paper came out, I remember reading it in 2012, and we all sat down in a lab meeting. I was at Oxford at the time doing my PhD. 2-3 labs of groups of labs sat together. We read this paper, and in that moment, we were all discussing, this means that we can change human beings. What does that mean? We were having those conversations in parallel, and that's unprecedented. But the salient point here is places like the Crick host things like the Human Genome Editing Summit that happened last week, right? People are discussing this across Earth. What do we do? How do we regulate this? What do we think? And you can tell immediately from attending or listening to any of these things, first of all, that there's a huge diversity of opinion. There's diversity across Earth. That's already been alluded to. It's very important. People regulate this thing differently, and people value different traits and diseases very, very differently. But also, people feel very differently about it, depending on whether or not you're dealing with a human body, a somatic case, like Jimmy's, right, versus a situation where it's potentially inheritable. So I really think that that's important for you to be aware of, right? I think there are a lot of conversations happening about it. A lot of institutions are doing a lot of work around this. But, it's a tool, right? This is the last thing I'll say about this. Science tells us how things work, right? It's a methodology for figuring out how things work, helps us understand stuff. And CRISPR has revolutionized the way we do science, how we do experiments. It helps us understand the world better. That precision is being used to sharpen our knowledge, right? But knowledge is not the same thing as value. Human beings decide what is or isn't valuable, right? Discovering why something happens or doesn't happen, or discovering that it impacts the organism that carries this gene in an apparently negative way, right? That is just about the biological level of life. And that can be true, but we can choose to value those things extremely differently. And that's where these kinds of conversations come in, right? Because we can all decide to value things very differently, should we wish to.
Which brings me excellently on to my next question, which is about that. How do we, as a society, collectively start making those value judgments about how things like gene editing and gene therapy should be regulated? And maybe between Tom and Güneş, we could have a sense of what are the current regulations on this? What is the regulatory framework like for it? And are things changing? Is there now an opening for things to be loosened up, so to speak?
I mean, I think the concern is that we don't have a world government, and so it's not so much what the regulations are, which, as you've described in the UK, you can't just go ahead and do these things. It's that some scientists might go to the weakest link in the chain, and what I'd be more interested about is how in places like the UK we could find a way to move forward responsibly in the way that we have done with so-called, by journalists, 3-parent babies, but various other technologies that are ethically fraught, but you have this mature discussion, and then you find a way to license things and work with things such that the power of the weakest country in the chain is diminished. And scientists think, well, I'll go and work in this country, which has the tools and has a framework for doing it if it's right and if we've had these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, so I should say again, this is where Robin would have been excellent for you guys. Robin is involved in all of these various organizations, the UN, WHO, things like that. So there is a lot of attempts to have these sort of regulatory conversations. The important point is every country, every jurisdiction effectively has its own set of values, right? And in certain places, we were hearing about this at the Human Genome Editing Summit, in fact, last week, some countries have said just, no, never on our watch will this happen. Other countries, we heard about Israel, for example, has a piece of legislation that has an automatic default every 5 years where it ceases to be relevant anymore. And that's built in deliberately to accommodate for the fact that the technology and the potential applications of this thing is going to, changes basically. And yeah, that's what there is to say there. The UK has always been a forerunner for these kinds of regulatory mechanisms. Things like the HFEA are used as gold standards across Earth, but it's up to anybody in their respective country to decide whether or not they want to use those frameworks, right?
Yeah, and this interplay between the national and international levels in terms of regulation, I think, is very important and very interesting, especially if we come back to that issue that I mentioned about global inequality. And Jimi, having heard all of this, where we're at in terms of regulation, where we're at in terms of disability rights, and I just want to come back to that question of, how you feel when you think about people in different parts of the world who are not able to access this technology and who may well, even if the technology was available, there might be different regulations around it, which might make it more unsafe or more unethical. I mean, what do you think, and I don't expect you to have the answer to this, but what do you feel maybe should be done to make sure that actually something like global equality could be a reality for something like this?
I think there definitely needs to be a global initiative, particularly for sickle cell, because more than half of the patient population is outside of the West. I think Nigeria has about 4 million patients that suffer from the disease. So, God willing, if we figure out a way to cure everyone in the West with the disease, we still haven't touched a fraction of people who are desperately, in need of a solution like this. I wanted to quickly go back to what Shani spoke about in regards to the ethics of it, because even myself seeing firsthand how the disease has changed my life. There are days I wake up and wonder, because I'm a very spiritual person, and wonder, what have I done? Because this is such a new technology that my research team is still going to have to watch me for 15 years to make sure that I haven't altered, or they haven't altered anything that we don't know about, because CRISPR hasn't really been tested in humans the way it has, for this specific sickle cell trial. So I completely get those ethical questions, and I think they need to be asked. I myself, every day, I think, and I wake up, sometimes I feel like I'm an X-Man, and because of how much better I'm feeling. But there are those days I wonder that, what if I was just supposed to die in my 20s? Maybe that is my part. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be cured. And to get to your point, doctor, with IVF as well, with sickle cell, I faced a lot of infertility, which led me and my wife to using the IVF to have children. So I have these questions. I often find myself like, maybe this is, and it really ties back to that, what your destiny is, because I'm such a spiritual person. I'm definitely loving living life, not feeling sickle cell the way I used to, but I would be a liar if I tell you that, there are days I think about, man, what have I done? On the other side of it, I feel a lot better, and I am always thinking back about and this is a lot easier to say now that I'm feeling good, but I always find that there's a beauty in the struggle. And obviously for me, the struggle has been sickle cell. And I wonder, what if that struggle was meant to be my destiny? And, now I feel like only time will tell.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. This makes me come back to you, Shani, because we've just had Jimi beautifully explain that kind of tension between feeling like he's playing God on one hand and actually being a very ordinary, humble human being who has been gifted an opportunity to live life to the full. When we've been talking about regulatory frameworks, we've been talking about national, international regulations, to what extent do you feel that the disability voice, and those are the lived experience, people like Jimi, how can we incorporate those voices into those discussions at the time of developing these technologies as opposed to afterwards, in a way that means that the things can be fairer and they do reflect the lived experience more accurately?
Well, this is the first time I've been involved in a conversation like this. And I think we as a community want to feel that included. We want to be included. We don't want to feel like it's being done to us. We want to be part of it as well, because we're the people that live with this. We're the people that live in this inaccessible society. And I think, just coming back to what Jimi beautifully shared there, wherever you sit on this line of, yes, great, or no, it's not quite for me. It's a very personal choice, and I'm glad that choice exists. I'm glad it does exist, and it can help people like Jimmy rather than if it didn't exist. I just want to share something I learned in the last couple of days. The charity Pregnant Then Screwed, who do a lot of activism around childcare costs, they shared a stat that 6 in 10 people terminated their pregnancy due to the high childcare costs.
Wow.
And it costs 3 times more to raise a disabled child.
Yes.
So again, to me, it comes back to this point that if society was more accessible, better organized, if people that design products for disabled people marketed and priced them fairly, then it would completely change the perception of disability. And, you know, I've met parents of disabled children who have been given a diagnosis, and they've said to me, it's the diagnosis that was actually the most scariest thing, not raising a disabled child. So we have to get away from this perception that disability is either that you're a benefit scrounger or everyone thinks you want to be a Paralympian. It's not that at all. But again, what does it come back to? Capitalism and very poor representation of a big part of society.
Wow, well said. We're coming to the close of our main part of tonight's questioning, although I'm now going to throw it to the audience because this is your opportunity to ask our amazing panel questions for yourself.
The ethics, it's clearly crucial. And in a country like the UK, we can have this conversation back and forth, but there are also rogue countries. There could be rogue labs, which no matter what we decide as a society, they might just go, and it could be a big country. And so the consequences of them doing, say, eugenics has a consequence for everybody else in the world as well. If they grow, the Superman or Superwoman, whatever that is, right? How do we deal with that? How do we think about the ethic problems outside our society?
That's a fantastic question, and doesn't just limit itself to gene therapy. I often think about what's happening in other countries. So, who wants to take this question?
Yeah, I feel like, especially after the Human Genome Editing Summit that happened literally last week in this building, I feel like lots of people talked about that, basically. So, well, and also importantly, as Tom said, we already live in a post-human genome edited world, right? There are 3 girls that live with edited genes on Earth already. But the reception was extremely present. And the Chinese government, these experiments were conducted in China, have subsequently changed their legislation and rules about these things and their regulations substantially. But ultimately, we can't. That's the uncomfortable thing about a society, right? All of us, we can't control it. What we can do is we can have conversations, invite people to be part of the conversation and sit around the same table. And things like the Human Genome Editing Summit was such a great example of that, because there were people from all over Earth coming to talk about how should we do this? What should we do? These are our concerns. But that's about it, because ultimately we don't have any control. We can influence, we can have those conversations, but we don't have a world government. That's the reality.
Brilliant. Did anyone else want to come in?
Actually, I want to ask a question,
Oh,
Jimmy. So I'm going to pop in because I think this may get to something interesting. One thing that I'm thinking, listening to you, is if we could move on to human genome, germline editing into designer babies in some sense. If you could imagine a situation in which it was possible to entirely eradicate sickle cell, not to cure it, but given it is such a simple genetic condition, to eradicate it from the earth forever, to have permanently evolved humanity out of it, would you do it?
No pressure.
I do it every day and twice on Sundays. Yeah,
Okay,
living with sickle cell, even I just mentioned, I have this debate in my head as to what lies ahead in the future with what I've done. But every day, if that decision was placed in front of me to completely eradicate sickle cell for me personally and for everyone else, I would give them that decision. But and I got to be honest and say this is more of my opinion. I know a lot of people that live with the disease that have become so enmeshed with the disease, and it's become a part of who they are. And that was actually one of the difficulties I faced after the transplant, is this identity of who Jimi is without sickle cell. So there's going to be that issue at play with patients that have genetic diseases that they incur at birth. It becomes literally their identity. And I've spoken to patients who are going through hell with sickle cell, but are not interested in having, gene editing because they don't know life without sickle cell.
Shani, you wanted to come in.
Yeah. So if you had asked me that question, and I'm someone where there isn't a cure, there's nothing that can really take away the condition that I have, I now would answer no, I wouldn't. Because I feel like when we ask people that question, especially to people where there isn't a cure, I feel like what we're asking them is your life valuable?
Yes.
Do you want to live? And I know you probably didn't mean that. Well, I hope you didn't mean that. But even though when people then, ask me, well, you're saying you wouldn't have a child with the same condition as you. And the difference is that I have a lot of privilege living in this country. I'm a palatable disabled person, let's be honest, that comes with privilege. But I've done the work. I've done the work to be happy with who I am, and I wouldn't be who I am without my condition.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's complicated, isn't it? It's not straightforward, and there's so many things that we are born with in terms of traits that we could select for. And, one of the questions actually from somebody who's watching online is, how do we make sure that we don't perpetuate these harmful discriminatory social norms over other things like race, gender, height? I mean, these are all things that maybe I would like to select for, but this is where we're talking about the line. Where do we draw the line? How do we make sure that this doesn't happen? Güneş, do you have any thoughts? How do we make sure that we don't start selecting for things like this?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's a question about how can you even select for those things?
Can we?
For some things, sure, but for some things, no. Right now, that's the point. Not everything is. I could have, again, we're back to the analogy, right? I have an embryo, I give it all the best possible genes. If I don't feed it, it's not going to be, even if I'd given it every gene on Earth, let's say, or variant on Earth that could make it 6'7", let's say I wanted that. But, it's not going to change that, right? So there are some things that are within our power and some things that aren't. And there are also moments where there are appropriate technologies and this is a really great technology to have available as an option, as a tool that is on the table, right? But again, the existence of a tool does not tell us when we want to use it, right?
100%. Again, so it comes back to this idea of science being a tool for us as a society to use in ways that we collectively decide are wise.
So one of the things I find interesting about this, though, is let's say that a proportion of the world do want to do this. They do want to select the children, and we have the ability to do it. Let's say, we are able to select children who are consistently 15 IQ points higher than the baseline, which would be absolutely massive. Well, that group of the population, which will be in the West because they'll be the ones who can afford it, and will also be the ones who've decided, I don't have ethical problems with this. Well, you've potentially created the ruling class, and everyone else can opt out of it. But then they suddenly find that they're not the ones with the children who are 15 IQ points higher. And I used to think that was more of a problem, but now again, I think we're going to be completely destroyed by the robots anyway. So it's utterly moot.
Join in for next week on artificial intelligence. There are more questions within the room, so I'd like to, yes.
Just building on the point of other revolutions going on. We've heard that there's great excitement in the lab and there's great ethical challenge. I'm not quite clear. I'd like your feedback on to what extent it will be a great health revolution in the sense that if we can use CRISPR, we can maybe change the microbiome in our gut and feel healthier. We can help animals be healthier. But I'm not quite clear beyond the 5 million that I think Tommy's saying, yep, absolutely. We should have a cure for. How many people, if the growth in CRISPR that's gone on over the last decade in the lab continues for another decade, beyond that 5 million, how many people potentially do have conditions that are addressable?
Great question.
Well,
Have you counted them?
This is gonna sound like a facetious answer, but it's not. Everybody is the point, right? Effectively.
8 billion.
Everybody who has DNA and has any kind of health, anything, situation, existing, pre-existing, or simply aging related, right? All of us are susceptible to the whims and mercies of our bodies, whether we like it or not. And so this tool allows us to invent new technologies, understand those mechanisms better, find new solutions and cures, and address every single one of those things that has a foot in DNA, theoretically. So that's why this is a health revolution. It's so not sexy to be like, yeah, because DNA editing is like amazing. And it's not immediately apparent, but just honestly, take a moment to appreciate this. Anything on Earth that has DNA can be edited, right? Whether that's the bacteria in our guts, whether it's the animals, whether it's the parasites, the plants, our entire ecosystem, every fish in the ocean, every human on Earth, theoretically, should we wish to.
And practically in the next decade?
Why not? Listen, there's already been people who've had their sickle cell disease cured, right? The important point is we start with situations where it's deemed ethical because these are just individual bodies. We're not affecting theoretically the inheritance. So you start there, and you start with a single gene situation like sickle cell, something that is very, very obvious. One gene has one error in it. It leads to a debilitating disease. Who wouldn't do something with that? The real heart of this question, the quandary that is CRISPR, is you have a tool on the table to cure everything that is possibly encoded in DNA, right? Importantly, it was also raised that these things can occur spontaneously and whatnot. So it will never cure all disability or all health conditions. That's not the point. But it can definitely provide alternative solutions and whatnot. The point is, the tool's on the table. Once it's out, once it exists, what is more ethical? To use it wisely or to not use it at all?
So look, we've got lots more questions. Please do come and ask the questions.
It's just one quick one in terms of...
Could you just come a bit closer to the mic?
Sorry.
Sorry, it's not made for you.
Yeah. Wrong genes. So in terms of if you're to edit, say, a single cell, as we were talking about earlier, that's the big discussion at single cell level. Do you then find out when that's turned into a human body, is those trillion cells enough to find out, okay, have we had an unintended consequence here? Or would we need to wait several human generations rather than cell generations, several human lifetimes to find out, oh, actually, grandkids from that editing, that's gone a bit wrong?
Great question. How long do we have to wait to know that we've messed up?
It depends. Biology has a way of showing its hand with time. So effectively, if it's really important, you'll find out pretty quickly. If it's relevant, it might take a bit longer. And it depends. It depends entirely. And transgenerational effects do happen. I think something that is very important to keep in mind, though, is bizarrely, I think whenever we talk about these sort of hypotheticals where we use this technology and things happen, I think people sort of forget that the tool continues to exist. So it's not that you use it one time and then it's like, oh no, like we've completely messed it all up and there's nothing we can do. That's not how it works. The tool remains there. Once you start tinkering, the tinkering commences. And the important point here is we're already tinkering with everything that we're doing. Like us sitting here in this room right now with the lives that we have led is already a far cry from what nature was intending for us. So just keep that in mind as well.
Brilliant. Next question.
I was just wondering if you could give a little detail on how this actually happens. So, Jimmy, how big a medical procedure was it? How long did it take? You talked about the number of cells we're talking about. That seems inconceivable that you can do it. I understand it in the lab, but I was just wondering, how does it actually work in a person?
Thank you. That is a brilliant question. Jimmy, can we just have your lived experience of what is it like to have gene therapy in a nutshell for everybody? And then we'll talk about...
It was a pretty cumbersome medical experience. I think it took about a year. I had to go through 3 main parts. The first part was the collection, where they collected the stem cells, and that took about 4 months. And then you go through the conditioning, basically wiping out your system, preparing it for your new edited, brand new DNA or stem cells. And then the final part will be the infusion, where they infuse your new cells, and then your white cells are knocked out. So you need to be in the hospital for a long period of time. So it was quite a long period. I think altogether it took just about a year.
So one thing I think is worth saying is, with these cures, that is not every cell in Jimmy's body, and some of the things that you look at. So another really promising area is macular degeneration, and you look at that because the eye, first of all, is a contained vessel. So you're just doing it in that. It's safer for various reasons, and you're looking at just changing the cells in the eye. So the rest of you would contain whatever mutation it is that gives you this degenerative blindness, but the bit of you to which is actually pertinent, where that gene's expressed, is the one that you're making the changes. So you wouldn't be looking to do every trillion cells. So only a bit of Jimmy is X-Men.
Even though he feels like an X-Man. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. There are more people who want to ask questions, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for coming forward.
Thanks so much. One of the things that I was thinking of when listening to this conversation was that it actually, a lot of other technologies are like this, in the sense that the science runs far ahead of the regulations, right? CRISPR was compared to smartphones at the start, and those are also revolutionary in the sense that they, give you the full repository of human writing, as well as let you communicate instantaneously with everyone in the world. And now the UK and US governments are thinking about maybe, say, putting restrictions on TikTok. So even about sort of designer babies, we might not have that right now, but of course, sex-selective abortions have been in practice for a very long time and are actually currently probably more practiced outside of the West than within it. So to what extent, we talk about trying to impose order and rules, but isn't in some sense the whole world like a petri dish? Right here is where the Industrial Revolution started, and we've been dumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and we still don't know the consequences. So aren't we being a bit naive when we consider that we might even be able to, how optimistic is it to say we will have a rule-based order for this?
So one of the things I find fascinating is you can do this yourself. There are people who have CRISPR'd themselves for various things, because it's tried to. Yes, we don't know how successful they are, but
can you just, for the audience's sake, tell them what you mean when you say CRISPR yourself?
Well, they have bought because these aren't. I mean, it's hard, but it's not. Most decent labs in the country can do this in the world, and you can send off for the DNA target you want. You can send off for the CRISPR-Cas9 system, and I don't know how to do it, but you know how to do it.
Yeah. So I can't believe I'm about to talk about this in public. Well, as I said, when the technology was first published, people were talking immediately about how important this thing is, and alongside that came a movement of people who call themselves sort of biohackers or independent researchers and things like that. They are basically people who are interested in the democratization of this technology, right? Which is a good idea, effectively, right? That's effectively what we're all talking about. There's this concern that we have: who has access to these things, to what end? I said at the beginning, the thing that makes CRISPR so special is that it's precise. And then I sort of tacked on, it's also quite quick and cheap as well, just like as the throwaway, because the heart of the debate is to do with the precision. But actually, you're completely right, Tom. This is really, really cheap to access. You don't need much in the way of complicated material to be able to just do it on a small scale. So people in the biohacking community and independent research community have been trying to do this, and they have successfully, you can genome edit bacteria or yeast or plants and things like that at home. And some people were injecting themselves, in fact. And there was a lot of conversation about that at the time, because it was like, well, what are you doing? Why are you trying to do this? And, how are you going to control this? How are we going to control this? That was the big conversation, the question. And the thing about that community is, and this is effectively the same thing that we're talking about in terms of sort of global regulation points, is how do you control someone? Well, we call it society, right? That's what we call it. We call it having conversation, having a community, whatever you want to call it. It's what your friends and peers deem to be acceptable. And we have these bizarre mechanisms by which we make it clear to other people that you just don't do that. Or if you do it, we alienate you because we don't like that. And that sounds really non-scientific, but that's the reality of how cultures affect human behavior. And this is no different to that, basically, I would say.
Yeah, there is a lady in pink who has a microphone.
It's a question for Jimi in the first instance. First of all, I just want to say how really, really happy I am for you that you're living a pain-free life and able to enjoy being a fulfilled, pain-free person. So that's fantastic. I was just wondering, you talked about some of the ethical issues that you grappled with post-treatment. Is this right? What about everyone else who may need help, who doesn't have access to help, either through by means of, because of where they are politically or economically, etc., or through geography. What ethical discussions or debates did you have with your medical practitioners prior to your treatment? And were those debates a part of the treatment package, and was your treatment contingent upon these debates, or did you only really have to think about these issues post-treatment?
Yeah.
Really great question is basically, how much did you have to individually think about the ethical issues when it came to your own treatment? Yeah, Jimi, tell us.
To be completely honest, I didn't think about it a lot at all, actually. I was really, really desperate at the time, pre-transplant. My wife was 8 months pregnant. Sickle cell had won every battle with me in my life, and fatherhood was a battle I wanted to win. So I went in head first, no questions asked. It hasn't been until I've had the transplant, I have been able to look back and ask myself these questions like, wow, look at what I had just done, and, all the fair points you brought up as to, where I'm from, how they're not going to get access to this for God knows how long. But no, I had no ethical debates with myself. My wife actually had to force me to read the consent form because I just wanted to sign and go. And then she had to force me, hey, listen, you could get all of these crazy things that, it said 15 years from now you can get leukemia and all these, and I didn't even care. I just wanted to sign and go.
Thank God for your wife. I just want to make sure that this side of the room, if you've got questions, you're being seen. I just realized I've got my back to you, but is there anyone on this side who wants to ask a question? Oh, I knew it.
So I was wondering, do you have any examples of specific enhancements, say, for want of a better word, that you could make right now that would make someone better? As a loaded question, but are there any examples you can think of?
I'm going to put quotation marks around the better.
Well, I was going to say, please define better in this. I mean, I don't know what to say. Okay, the classic enhancement narrative revolves around putting genes in that shouldn't be there at all, right? So, for example, we could... eyes, there's a good one. Okay, so eyes are easy enough to deliver, relatively easy to deliver into the easiest system, in fact, is of course the blood system, which is why we sickle cell. But let's say the eyes. We could probably insert genes that are helpful for making different kinds of, that in the back of your eyes you have rods and cones, they're different receptors for different kinds of light. Yeah, well, different species on Earth have different forms of those that allow them to see different kinds of wavelengths and things like that. Look at this, Tom's on board, sign him up, no consent form required. But yeah, so we could do that. There you go. How's that for a theory? We could insert some genes from other species that are known to have really interesting effects and see what happens. One that's also being discussed a fair bit is to do with like space travel. So sending human beings into space. Yeah, it's a thing. If you want to send a manned mission to Mars, you need to change human bodies because we're not exactly adapted to living under intense radiation. We live on a planet with a nice soft ozone blanket. Fair enough, it's got a hole in it. But yeah, you don't have that out in space. So there's already talk about, which genes would we need to alter in human beings to make them more resilient to space travel. Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely bizarre, isn't it, when you start thinking about what might be possible right now. I've got this really interesting question from someone online, Amrita D'Souza, who has asked, how should consent be dealt with, especially with germline editing? And should individuals be able to make decisions about their own genetic enhancement, or should society as a whole have a bigger say in how far gene editing is allowed to go? Shani, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think, as I said earlier, I'm glad the option for gene editing exists. Just, Jim is a brilliant example of that. Enhancements is a different arena, isn't it? I feel like society already dictates that some bodies are more valuable than others. So we kind of already have that. So, if you're not able to work or be productive in society, then you're seen as less valuable and, benefit cheat, that kind of narrative. I feel like we're already there, but no, I don't think that society should. I think it should be an individual decision, but not about enhancements, about editing.
Yeah, and what this question is getting at is the germline editing. So it's not where it goes beyond just you and your body, but if you had kids, they would also potentially take that on. I mean, we're talking about editing out literally the evolution of the human species. And I wonder if you guys have thoughts on this in terms of consent around this and who should be making those decisions.
I mean, if we decide as a society to do that, then they're literally the only people who can give the consent to the parents. I mean, I think the easiest thing in the world would be to say, no, we should never do it. But I think you very rapidly end up with situations where you think, well, is it wrong not to do it?
And I'm going to be really contentious here and say it's already happening. Sorry, the lives, in the sense of literally, the life you live in the body that you are in prior to having children will impact how your children turn out. Right? No one's asking me, oh, Güneş, should you put the burger down? Stop eating fatty things. No, but I'm being serious. Like, it sounds like I'm being ridiculous, but it's true. Sorry. The lives we live already impact the next generation. Actually, I think Shani said something that was really key to this thing. I think CRISPR has held up a mirror to us all and how uncomfortable we feel actually about the control that we as human beings have. I think that's actually what's happening, right? So far, we've done all sorts of things. Human beings have changed all sorts of stuff, right? As I said before, ain't nothing natural about what's happening right now. But we've never really felt quite so like, hi, what would you do about it, right? And we're having that moment where the microphone is being shoved into our faces collectively. And I think a lot of us are feeling that natural instinct to shrink back and go, oh,
Also, I mean, I'd add, in terms of germline editing of my children, the idea that I'm creating something that goes down the generation. I mean, the power I have to already do that in simply choosing who my wife is considerably larger than CRISPR, and considerably, more control, given we do understand what's going to happen there. My wife, I've already got a whole suite of genes which I'm going to get half of in my children, or my children are going to get half of. And I can see how they've turned out there.
So it's almost as if you're inviting us to think about what we already can do and we already have control over, and to then re-evaluate what control in this context actually means. Look, the conversation is fascinating. We have literally 1 minute left. Do we have time for one more question? One more question from the floor, and you've been waiting very patiently, so I'm gonna I'm gonna allow you to come forward.
Thank you very much. I think quite often we see that legislation and ethics can kind of fall behind the development. And then you also talked about how ethics can then run ahead of what's actually capable. Do you think that that's kind of an unhelpful sci-fi vision, or maybe it can actually, or even cause fear-mongering, or kind of help predict and anticipate legislation so that these things can be regulated better?
Yeah, go for it, Güneş.
That's a really, really cool question, I think. Well, I think that this is a tool and that human beings choose how they wield their tools. So the fact that this conversation runs way ahead of what the science is capable of is a really good thing, because it helps us process as a collective what we want to do and don't want to do. Another arena in which we already do that, which is far less scary sounding than like regulation and legislature and all that sort of stuff, is sci-fi, actually. Science fiction books and like TV shows and things like that, they allow us to run the thought experiment and imagine these things, and to sort of engage with these ethical quandaries in a really tangible and fun kind of way, but also genuine way. And they do shape how we feel about it. And what I'm ultimately saying is the conversations we have will shape how we feel about using the tool. The tool doesn't change, right? It will just change how we feel comfortable or don't feel comfortable using it, ultimately. So more conversations.
Shani.
And briefly, just to add, I took part in the NHS's 100,000 genome project. And so I went and gave my blood, as did my mum and dad. And it was to try and see if we could find out why I was born with the condition. And for years and years and years, they're like, yeah, we haven't found anything. And then they wrote to me back, I think in a few years ago. And they said, we've got some news for you. And I never did anything about it. And I found that letter the other day, and I just think I forgot about it. But like, what's going to change in my life really knowing about it? Like if I was really interested, then cool. But, and like, one part of me does want to find out, but it's not going to change anything. And actually, my mum was like, oh, why do you want to blame one of us as in me? I was like, no. I was like, but I wanted to be part of that project to also help, with science and future generations as well. So you're absolutely right. These tools are tools, but really the change we think that they might make, to some people it doesn't matter, and we don't want it.
Yeah, and this is the importance of having a collective conversation like we've had tonight. And it has been a scintillating conversation. I have certainly found it thought-provoking. I would like to extend my thanks to Shani Dhanda, Güneş Taylor, Jimi Olaghere. Thank you so much for joining us, and Tom Whipple. And I'd also like to thank Intelligence Squared for putting on this event for all of us together. And of course, our hosts, the Crick Institute. The Brilliant Cut and Paste exhibition, which is on here at the Francis Crick Institute in London, is going on until December 2023. But don't wait until then to go and see it. If you haven't seen it already, please go now. And obviously, finally, a massive thank you to our amazing audience for all of your thought-provoking questions. Thank you for joining us this evening. Good night.